Good morning, everyone. My name is Trushar Patel. I am one of the CSPD program committee member. I come from University of Lethbridge. Our university's indigenous name is Iniskim, meaning Sacred Buffalo Stone, and our university is located at the traditional Blackfoot Territory Confederacy. We are about to start an interactive panel today titled Canadian Universities, News, Frontier, and Societal Challenges that is organized by Toronto Metropolitan University. And I'm really excited to look forward for this panel, especially because the times have changed. There was a pandemic that we have been experiencing a little bit, leftover effect. And during this time, the way we communicate the news and university has faced challenges as well. So this is going to be a very interesting and interactive panel. Before I go, I'd like to remind you all that the hashtag for the Twitter account, if you like to tweet for today's event and other events, it is @SciencePolicy, and hashtag is CSPC 2022. And finally, we would like to hear back from you. So please provide us feedback by going to the app and sending us your comments and what you like and what can we improve for the next time. Thank you. I'll leave to Dr. Stephen Leaves now.
Bonjour, bienvenue. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here together, and I'm delighted to see all of you today and to have the opportunity to moderate this panel on New Frontier and Societal Challenges. I'm delighted to be joined by an outstanding group of panelists who I'll introduce in a moment, and look forward to the discussion today. But first, I'd like to express my thanks and appreciation to Merdad and the Canadian Science Policy Centre, and particularly the many dedicated volunteers who worked so hard to make this event possible today. In 2019, following an interesting experience I had working in the Israeli innovation ecosystem with the Canadian ambassador to Israel at the time, Deborah Lyons, we organized a session here at the CSPC on global relationships in an innovation economy and capitalizing on Canadian strengths and collaboration and partnership. It was followed in 2020 with an additional panel along the same theme, particularly as we were in the throes of the beginning of the pandemic, on looking at the capitalizing on Canada's strengths and leveraging science diplomacy and the contributions it would make to the economic recovery. And following that in 2021, skills for inclusive innovation. And today, we find ourselves in a country that is remarkable in many respects, represented by global excellence, overall quality of our post-secondary system, supported by government, and a diverse and inclusive society anchored with relative political and economic stability. And it's rooted in strong democratic principles. However, we still face challenges to engage effectively in a global innovation ecosystem, to accelerate and scale, to make up for the shortfalls in funding, vulnerabilities to global geopolitical dynamics, supply chains, and demand for talent are looming. So notwithstanding the country's strengths and many advantages, Canada continues to lag behind on global forecasts of economic activity and innovation. This is a really important juncture at this particular time, and perhaps no other time in history. Universities are facing challenges to serve many purposes, and the importance of being windows and doors to the world has never been so critical. The successful university of the 21st century will be predicated on partnerships and collaborations, regionally, nationally, and globally. And then there are the intractable global challenges. Many of those challenges have been discussed over yesterday, today, and will be tomorrow. And those will require new ideas, innovative solutions, actions, skill, talent, collaborations, and partnerships. And I'm delighted that we have such an outstanding group of panelists who bring various perspectives. To my right, Dr. Stephen Toop, who's just recently returned to Canada to head CFAR, following serving as the 346th Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University. With us today, also Simon Kennedy, Deputy Minister, Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, and with a particular perspective and background and interest in science policy and the tools and instruments through policy that will advance our country's future. Joining us virtually is Dr. Sophie Damour, who is a professor of engineering, an outstanding, accomplished scholar and researcher who's worked on the precipice of innovation, particularly related to the forestry sector, but also serves as the rector of the Université Laval and was the first woman to serve that role and has just begun her second term. And finally, Alicia Main, sitting at my far right, who is a professor of, actually the W.J. Van Dusen Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship in the Beatty School of Business at Simon Fraser University, and it serves as the Associate Vice President, Knowledge Mobilization and Innovation at SFU. I'd like to just describe what will happen today. We will have some introductory remarks and comments by each of our panelists, followed by some discussion on some key issues that are emerging from that discussion, and particularly focusing on key questions around partnerships, collaborations, ambitions, and expectations, the national and provincial approaches and the alignment around those strategies that advance our country, and the role of science diplomacy at our universities and global affairs. And finally, to really come to the heart of the key question of whether or not we have the right policies and approaches in place. So I'd like to invite Dr. Sophie Damour to lead off the conversation with introductory remarks. She's joining us virtually from Laval, and hopefully people will be able to see her as well. I can see her on the screen in front of me, but over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Stephen, and hello to all of you. I'll do my introduction in French. So if you need the equipment, I believe there are, I've been told, some translation facilities. That's okay, Stephen? Is that the case? Oui? Alors, merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tout le monde. C'est un réel plaisir d'être avec vous ce matin en ligne. Je remercie les organisateurs d'avoir permis ma présence dans ces conditions. Puis je vous dis, j'aurais préféré être avec vous, là, soyez-en assurés plutôt. Écoutez, construire une économie prospère, durable et inclusive demande une grande capacité de recherche, d'innovation et de commercialisation. Puis pour développer cette capacité, puis je mets ça simplement, on doit miser sur des conditions gagnantes. Je vais faire une petite parenthèse en rappelant une image que vous connaissez ou un motto que vous connaissez certainement, celui des agents immobiliers. Hein? Quand on demande à un agent immobilier quelle est la condition gagnante pour vendre sa maison, ils vous diront localisation, localisation, localisation. Dans le monde économique dans lequel nous sommes actuellement, dans le monde de la recherche, de l'innovation, de la commercialisation, je vous dirais que le motto, c'est le talent et le talent. Évidemment, cette condition essentielle ne suffit pas. Il faut des découvertes, il faut des infrastructures de pointe, il faut un écosystème en appui aux innovateurs et aux innovatrices qui va soutenir la commercialisation et la prise de risque. L'État, les universités, les entreprises et les services socio-économiques ont tous un rôle à jouer important afin de permettre et de nous permettre comme pays de participer à une grande course qui a lieu en ce moment à travers la planète. Je vous dirais que depuis l'industrialisation, on a vécu ce qu'on nous décrit comme étant 5 grandes vagues d'innovation à l'échelle mondiale. Toutes ces vagues sont venues après d'importantes crises géopolitiques, des grandes guerres, des crises économiques. Et maintenant, ce que l'on voit, c'est un ensemble de crises géopolitiques. Il y a eu la pandémie, il y a la guerre en Ukraine, il y a les défis mondiaux économiques. Suite à ces crises-là, on a vu des investissements majeurs, massifs en innovation pour accélérer le développement d'une nouvelle économie, notamment à travers de nouvelles technologies, de nouveaux savoir-faire qu'on a souvent appelés de rupture. Puis à chacune de ces vagues, que ce soit, et là je vais parler en termes d'ingénieurs, mais il y a plein d'autres exemples, que ce soit l'arrivée de la machine à vapeur, l'hydroélectricité, la pétrochimie, l'Internet ou l'intelligence artificielle, le pouvoir économique s'est redéfini, tant au point de vue domestique qu'international. Actuellement, la 6e grande vague est lancée et elle a de particulier sa vision plus sociétale. Et pour exprimer l'importance des investissements que l'on voit actuellement, mais on peut penser au plan vert, le Green Deal européen, 1 000 milliards d'euros, le Build Back Better des Américains, plus de 3 000 milliards de dollars américains, des plans de relance qui misent sur le besoin de trouver des solutions à des défis pressants de la société, notamment ceux liés au changement climatique. Devant autant d'investissements, il faut se poser la question, qu'est-ce que le Canada peut faire? Et ça, on en parlera certainement tout à l'heure plus en détail. Nos universités et la recherche, dans ce contexte mondialisé, se sont aussi internationalisées grandement au cours des 20 dernières années. Je veux vous parler, parce que je veux vous parler d'innovation et de recherche, plus spécifiquement de nos doctorants. Hein, je vous ai parlé de talent, les doctorants, ces personnes qui portent la recherche au pays et notre capacité d'innovation sont extrêmement importants. Aujourd'hui, ils représentent 6 des étudiants universitaires à travers le pays, ça depuis les 10 dernières années. Ce qui est différent, c'est la part d'étudiants internationaux dans ces 6 %-là. La proportion d'étudiants internationaux inscrits au doctorat augmente de façon importante au pays. Et si on se pose la question, est-ce qu'on peut maintenir notre capacité d'innover sans les étudiants internationaux au pays? La réponse est non. Je vais vous donner l'exemple de l'Université Laval. En sciences et génie, il et elle représentent tout près de 66 de nos étudiants inscrits au doctorat. En médecine, c'est 61 Notre capacité de faire de la recherche et d'innover dépend majoritairement dans plus de 9 grands champs disciplinaires de l'Université Laval d'étudiants internationaux. C'est vrai pour le talent, mais c'est vrai pour les infrastructures, c'est vrai pour la capacité de recherche. Plus que jamais, on doit faire équipe, établir des collaborations à l'international, joindre nos forces. Et je vous donne l'exemple de la recherche nordique et arctique, une grande force de l'Université Laval. Il nous serait impossible de mener ces recherches sans des partenariats importants avec des équipes internationales. Je pense entre autres à la France et l'entente entre la France et le Canada qui nous permettent maintenant de partager nos flottes maritimes de recherche ou encore toutes les innovations en termes de structuration de la recherche internationale. Je finis en disant quelques mots sur l'innovation, le rôle des universités, entre autres. D'abord, la compréhension un peu simpliste qu'on a du processus d'innovation comme étant un processus linéaire. En fait, c'est plus complexe que ça. Je suis sûre que tout le monde dans la salle comprend ça. Et d'intensifier l'importance de la proximité entre les scientifiques, les acteurs de la société civile et les gens d'affaires. Et de ne pas minimiser tout le cycle, ne pas le considérer en silo, mais bien dans un écosystème qui doit être soutenu tout au long du processus des découvertes, de l'innovation et de la commercialisation. Si on ne fait pas ça, on n'y arrivera pas. Et on n'arrivera pas à stimuler une culture de l'innovation. Il y a encore trop peu d'entreprises qui aujourd'hui ont l'intention d'innover ou encore un projet d'innovation. Et ça se répercute dans l'investissement en R&D à l'échelle nationale qui, lorsqu'on le compare aux pays innovants, est beaucoup trop faible. On parle de 1,6, 1,7 % du PIB. Alors, je ne vais pas m'étendre plus longuement, mais je voulais donner quelques éléments concrets là, en lien avec les défis qui se pointent à nous. J'espère que ça pourra contribuer à lancer la conversation. Merci, Stephen.
Thank you, Sophie. I'd like to invite Dr. Stephen Toop to provide his introductory remarks.
Bonjour à tout le monde et merci beaucoup, Stephen, pour l'opportunité d'être ici ce matin. Je voudrais remercier les organisateurs pour cette invitation. I want to build a little bit on Sophie's remarks in relation to international partnerships. And I want to make the case that Canada really must focus, and Canadian universities must focus, even more than we have in the past, on strengthening our international research collaborations. It has to be, for Canada, I believe, a top priority. I think some of the reasoning behind that is utterly obvious. We simply can't address the societal challenges that are noted in the topic for our panel, climate change, pandemic disease, income inequality, the decay of democracy. None of us can deal with those as single institutions, no matter how prestigious our universities may be, and certainly none of us can deal with those questions as individual countries. So much so obvious, I suppose. But one of the things that I've learned over the last few years living in the United Kingdom and seeing the consequences of Brexit play out within the research community, and talking with colleagues from Switzerland who themselves have now twice been in a position where they've effectively lost access to their European partnerships. When that happens, immediately one's research influence and even one's research productivity begins to go down. There's some amazing statistics out of Switzerland from the first time they were kicked out of the European research system. So all of that to say that I think it's sad that the UK has put itself in that position. But for Canada, the lesson is we've got to work harder, it seems to me, to build international collaboration, because we don't have anything like yet the European system to plug into. We're still dealing with lots of bilateral agreements. We're dealing with funding mechanisms that don't necessarily allow or encourage effective international collaboration. And I'll come back to that. We need seamless funding matched with open immigration and visa policies. And I would say that Canada has been pretty good on the latter and not so good on the former. Canada's research reputation is, as Stephen emphasized, strong internationally. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves. We're not always the first place that people look for international collaboration. Yes, we punch above our weight, but not massively so. So I think we need to focus our efforts and to build stronger international partnerships. We need more examples of Canadian leadership, as we've shown, for example, in artificial intelligence, where we were the first country to have a national strategy, and we've been building consistently year after year an expanded and quite brilliant talent pool. Of course, I'm very proud that CFAR convenes that national strategy. But there are many other places where we need to be thinking about how we build similar strength. I think we are poised to lead, but it won't happen automatically. And I think there are areas in policy, funding, and even in vision that need to be addressed urgently. And I'm going to set out 5. We need more research funding that can be used to promote and enhance global partnerships. Again, I'm very proud that CFAR has for 40 years done this brilliantly by building international networks around some of the world's most urgent problems. But we need greater scale, not just in CFAR, but for Canada. We need scale, and it can happen in many different parts of the country in many different ways. But understanding the importance of research funding that is flexible, that can be deployed in international partnerships is, I think, crucial. Secondly, we need to further strengthen our visa processes to facilitate the attraction of talent. As Sophie said, talent, talent, talent. This is discussed all around the world. Everyone is in a competition for talent, and we do have advantages with a very strong basic immigration policy, we're not always so good on the delivery. We're not always so good in ensuring timely processing, et cetera. And that's something we have to look at carefully. Thirdly, I think the government has to work with partners to facilitate connectivity with key international players. And there are people out there, Sophie mentioned some of them, the UK, France, Germany, Switzerland, Japan, Singapore, Israel. Tremendous investments being made, great research productivity, great innovation. We can and need to be part of that through partnerships. And of course, the work that's being done potentially to bring Canada into the EU system of research is fundamentally important. Fourthly, I think that we need a clearer Canadian strategy on next generation talent. The chair of the science committee talked about that earlier. We need a talent building, attraction, and connectivity strategy. It's interesting, I believe it's still the case that there are fewer PhDs working in industry in Canada than in many of our sister and competitor countries. We've got to think about that and understand why that is the case. Again, I'm very proud that CFAR has a fabulous Azrieli Global Scholars Program that does, in fact, work to build out international talent connectivity for Canadians and global young scholars. But again, scale is not where it needs to be for Canada. And then finally, and this is a slightly different issue, but it's, I think, quite important and perhaps never more than today, having seen the interaction between the Prime Minister and President Xi on the sidelines of a recent conference. We need, I think, some clear guardrails to clarify how best to engage with important players like China and India that raise issues of academic freedom, security, IP protection, and even researcher safety. I think this is an area where the government and university sector should be collaborating to come up with an approach that we are comfortable with and that provides clarity. When I was at Cambridge, we created a set of international engagement principles to do just that, but I think Canada needs to do it at a national level. Finally, others are going to talk about industry connectivity much more than I, but there is no doubt that Canada is strong on spin-offs from research labs and startups, but it's weak in scaling up. And that's an area where I would really try to focus our energies. Interestingly, exactly the same problem in the United Kingdom. Everyone's talking about it, so some shared conversations might be useful. My own view, and just to put the oar in the water, is that this is not a question of IP policy primarily at all. I know we get caught up in that consistently. I don't think that's the issue. For me, I would focus on two things. I would want to build out strength in our tech transfer expertise within universities. We have some great people, but we don't, I think, have the level of expertise that the top players do internationally. And then finally, I would try to work hard, and we'll hear from you, I think, on this, in building out management expertise in scaling up. We don't have enough people who've been through it, failed, sort of picked themselves up and got going again. That's clearly a distinguishing factor between places like Canada and the UK and what happens in Silicon Valley. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So over to you, Alicia, to respond.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And unfortunately, I have some slides, but their presentation's not available. So I'll respond to those comments, and you can imagine the slides. I'll describe them to you. So thank you for those very insightful comments on both our global challenges and the ways that we can strengthen our international networks and of research excellence. The part that I wanted to dig in on is how to take the value of those research excellence international networks. I would call those intangible assets that we have as Canadians from our research and to mobilize them more effectively. So I'm Alicia Main, an innovation and entrepreneurship scholar. I've also been working for the past 7 years in collaboration with my colleagues and with MyTax in trying to give scientists and researchers the tools to make early stage decisions while still in the research lab that shape their science innovation and that endow spin-off companies that they then can scale later. But the decisions and the innovation policy happen many years before those scalable spin-offs get launched. So in Canada, yes, we do well in creating spin-offs, but not necessarily those ones that are attached to our breakthrough research. And then we have problems with scale because some of the early stage path-dependent decisions have not been made or supported. So my challenge to you is to think about innovation policy mechanisms that could help shape those early stage decisions and help endow our breakthrough science and the people, the agents who are transferring that to be able to respond to global challenges, to be able to help us create economic growth at the same time as we respond to COVID or come up with climate solutions. So the slides I was going to show you first was a picture of a scientist whose name is Carl Hansen, Dr. Carl Hansen. Could you raise your hand if you have heard of this scientist? I'm glad to see. That's wonderful. So particularly the delegations from Vancouver, very familiar. But Carl Hansen was the founder and scientist entrepreneur who founded Accelera, a company that came to prominence during COVID for creating the first FDA approved therapeutic to treat COVID. And Accelera rapidly jumped to a $15 billion market cap, was solving a major problem, saving lives, and looked like an overnight success story. But the reality is, of course, as many in this room know, this is not an overnight success story. This is a 20-year story. It's a 20-year story of the actions and decisions that were made, of path-dependent shaping of breakthrough science and science innovation to enable the vehicles in the world, the science-based spin-offs that could respond and could scale. So the example there, a timeline, my colleagues and I did an analysis, a deep study of this process, the pre-formation processes, and published it in Nature Nanotechnology this summer. And 20 years ago, that scientist, Carl Hansen, was in the UCLA lab of Stephen Quake, himself an accomplished scientist entrepreneur, who was able to mentor him, was able to patent with him, gave him access to international networks and financing, which he brought with him when he came to UBC in 2005. And the funding, including from Michael Smith Foundation and Genome Canada, that enabled his students to work on the applications of his breakthrough research on microfluidics, that enabled them some flexible funding, as to Professor Tube's comments, and that enabled them to make early stage decisions about IP strategy, about the prioritization of markets, about building the founding team. Those things, if they hadn't been funded, or if they had been funded with mechanisms that took away the IP, for example, or that made them go to an outside company, that would have changed the path and the endowment of what eventually became a very, very impactful and now turning into an anchor company in Vancouver. So in the research that we do and what we've been tracking with other Canadian and international science-based spinoffs, we look at the international networks of these star scientists and scientist entrepreneurs. We look at their patents and at their publications, and we say that you can't just count those. Those are intangible assets. They're important assets. They're valuable for us as a country. But you can't just count those. You have to think about how they're being mobilized. And you have to think about the actors who we're asking to be agents of change and mobilization. The Honorable Kirsty Duncan said to us this morning, to these scientists, I see you. Well, let's see the path that they're taking, that we're asking these graduate students and postdocs and international talent to take. Let's look at what decisions we are asking them to make as they found scalable science-based ventures, and think about what tools we've given them to do so. If we follow those paths, and we look also to our climate challenges and look at what we would like to enable there, again, we punch way above our weight in invention. And we have many companies that are on the Global Clean Tech 100. But how do we systematically allow more of that in conjunction with our international collaborations? And the last picture I was going to show you on my slides was another scholar switching to the climate crisis, Professor Stephen Holdcroft. Could you raise your hand if you know of Professor Stephen Holdcroft? Only a few hands. I hope more of you do. He's a professor at Simon Fraser University with deep credibility in the AEM water electrolysis to create hydrogen, clean hydrogen, and has international networks in Germany, across Scandinavia, across Europe, Japan, China. Vancouver was a bit of a birthplace of hydrogen, of green hydrogen production, and Stephen Holdcroft has been through that whole journey, but hadn't started a startup until his graduate students had the mindset and became into the support network of innovation. And I think that his spinoff that's come out of his lab and the international networks that are advancing there are an example of what we could do with that resource, with that international tacit knowledge and trust, with that research excellence, to mobilize it, to better meet the challenges of our time, in this case with climate. And my challenge again to this panel and to you is, what kind of innovation policy can actually effectively align the incentives of those key actors and support them as we mobilize more of the value of our intangible assets? Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. Simon.
Hello? Good. It's nice to be here, everybody. As was noted at the start, I run the Federal Industry Department, so we have oversight responsibilities for the federal granting system, research granting system, and are involved in science policy. I know a lot of folks in the room, everyone will know I'm not a scientist, but I've been around science policy my whole career, and I'm now in a position where I work very closely with the research granting councils and the scientific community on all of these matters. So it's really good to be here today to have a chance to talk to you. I thought what I might do when I was considering what would I talk about today was to relay, I guess, some of the impressions of the people in Ottawa around the experience with COVID, because I think the COVID pandemic is really a really interesting test case for a lot of the issues we're talking about today, and I'll try to explain why that is. I think it's not an understatement to say that COVID saved us. Science kind of saved us from COVID. And I mean that in a literal sense with the development of vaccines and the kind of miraculous speed with which they were put into use around the world. But I also mean that in the sense that science kind of saved Canada in the context of COVID. When COVID-19 hit, obviously the government went into high gear, and a lot of time and effort was being spent, late nights, here in the capital, trying to figure out how do we best, prepare the country, what are the things that need to be done. And I have to say there was, as you might expect, a real lack of clarity on what the prospects might be for a vaccine, what will be the best way to develop medical countermeasures, how do we, prepare the population, how do we try to protect people's lives. This was like a really fundamental preoccupation for policymakers, as you can expect in the early days of the pandemic. There were cabinet meetings practically every day to discuss these matters. And I would say my own feeling is that it was the scientific community that really helped us figure our way through some of this. That's not an understatement. One of the great things I think about the research community in Canada is that we have really great linkages with senior people in government and policymakers. There is a good dialogue that is regular. Many of you are involved in that. And myself and others had, prominent scientists, very thoughtful people coming forward and saying, have you thought about doing this? Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but here is a way, that maybe we can be better prepared as a country to confront this problem. How do we get science advice into the decision-making chain? What are other countries doing? And this led, in fairly short order, actually, after the declaration of a global pandemic, to the creation of the government's vaccine task force, where we had some of the most prominent scientists and virologists and other, and people with industrial expertise on this task force to help us formulate a strategy and to give the government good advice on, in the area of vaccines about how to actually get ready for what was coming. And that led to the government's strategy to, secure advanced purchase agreements. The vaccine task force, interviewed many of the companies. We were the second country in the world to invest in the Moderna vaccine, by the way, after the United States, very, very early on. Very impressed with the science, and at the time it was a big bet, but this seems like a good thing to put our money against. And the entire strategy to source vaccines, the vaccines chosen, what quantities, all of this was guided by an independent kind of science advisory panel that was set up at the urging of some of our prominent scientists very early on in the pandemic. So, I think it is not an understatement to say that we relied very heavily on the scientific expertise in Canada to respond to COVID-19. The other thing I would say, which kind of goes with the topic today, is that we did not have the capacity to manufacture any of these vaccines in this country. And I can assure you, we went, company by company, door to door, talking to every player we could to see whether we could technology transfer the vaccines into Canadian facilities to have them made here. And by the way, what's interesting about that is that our scientific community had excellent linkages into every single one of these companies. People working in the companies had once been the postdoc of the Canadian professor. Like, it was really, really shocking to see really, really deep, well-respected expertise in our universities. Some of the most prominent scientists in the field are Canadian, and large numbers of the scientists and managers and leaders of these international pharmaceutical companies and vaccine companies are actually Canadian or studied in Canada. And so we had no trouble doing the telephone game and figuring out who do we talk to in Canada that is well respected by this person over here we need to talk to at AstraZeneca or Moderna or Pfizer or whatever. So we relied as well on these very deep networks in the science community to actually build relationships with some of these companies. But none of the companies had the ability to make the vaccine in Canada at scale. So kind of lesson number one, we have, at least in this particular area of, in biomanufacturing and life sciences, we have this like deep, partly a legacy, I guess, of Connaught Labs and, this kind of storied history. But we have deep expertise in our universities, in the research community, but that is not translated, it's certainly not, in the early days of the pandemic, into any really serious, with a few exceptions, any really serious industry capabilities in Canada. And so we were saved by the scientific relationships that we had across the world, and we were saved by the expertise in Canada to tell us what to do, but we relied almost entirely on the manufacturing capacity in other countries to actually execute on the strategy that our scientists helped to formulate. And that little story I've told, you can repeat in field after field. So this is a real problem for policymakers. So in Ottawa, when we talk about commercialization and knowledge translation and scale up and the things we've been talking about on the panel today, it's not science versus industry. It's a kind of a profound concern that we're not matching, the firepower and expertise we have in the scientific community with what we need on the industrial side. And I would say as a policymaker, this is a problem that in a sense is only going to get worse if we don't find a way to solve it. Because when I look at the post, again, using the pandemic as a bit of a thought experiment, when you look at the post-pandemic reality, governments are now urgently figuring out, how do we produce a vaccine in 100 days? How do we pool our resources? How do we make sure we have better international surveillance? Like, I don't want to overstate it, because there was a lot of nationalism and a lot of closing of borders and so on. So I wouldn't say we're all going to hold hands, but there's definitely a more acute sense that the big threats actually demand that allies cooperate, and actually demand that we compare notes, and actually are going to result in governments putting more money and more effort, not just into the science, but into the industrial response capacity. I've received a lot of money in my organization, not me personally, but the government has put a lot of money into our organization to support biomanufacturing and life sciences. And research has got to be a key part of that, but what we're really interested in is we need the firepower, if there's another pandemic, to be able to have some domestic response capabilities, so we're not totally dependent on the rest of the world. And I think that that's going to be a more prominent phenomenon internationally. So if we're going to play internationally on the science front, we need to bring not just the good science to the table, we actually have to bring industrial capability and know-how and kind of firepower to the table, so that we have something to trade beyond having, great scientists, because the great scientists are mobile, and a lot of our very best scholars, as you know, they leave the country to go, take opportunities further afield. So I think one of the things we need to be thinking about when it comes to international partnerships is, how do we do a better job of linking not just the scientific community, but the scientific community and industry, and that kind of nexus kind of internationally. The second thing I would say is that we are not particularly good, or at least in the pandemic, and again, this is a personal reflection, I'm really sorry, but I think a lot of people in Ottawa thought that, in contrast to some of our allies, that we're able to rally kind of the research community towards answering really big kind of strategic urgent questions, that we weren't as good in our ability to do that as perhaps others were, Israel, the UK, et cetera, that we were maybe still too much relying on, we're handing out small dollar grants to large numbers of people, and not like piling significant resources into answering very focused questions that we needed to actually address an immediate urgent problem facing the country. And so I think there is a question for us in a way about, how do you bring science and research to bear to answer like really big questions. I think we do a really good job at the kind of talent development. I think there's an open question about how well we do on the kind of grand challenge, really, figuring out big problems dimension. We are not systematic in how we engage, at least at the government level, I think, on international scientific collaboration. I think what I felt during the pandemic, I think a lot of people felt, was we had a lot of really great connections, but a lot of them were personal connections, or they were institution-to-institution connections. They certainly weren't kind of deep structural, connections that are supported, as Stephen said, by serious, funding and so on. I think that's changing. We are very keen to be participating in Horizon Europe, but I think in general, we have been very ad hoc in how we approach engagement in science internationally. And the last thing I would just note, again, as a layperson, not a scientist, is one of the lessons I think of the pandemic was just how interdisciplinary science is becoming. And we talk about Accelera, but whether it's Accelera or whether it's Moderna, I mean, we're fusing more and more engineering and biology and mathematics and physics are now, Moderna. Somebody had told me, I don't know if this is true, it's a little bit apocryphal, I guess, but that the reason for the temperature, the storage differential from some of the mRNA vaccines actually had to do with the people that were on staff at some of the pharmaceutical companies, and actually people who understood the kind of the physics of the molecules and how to basically construct a molecule that actually will be more stable at a higher temperature. I don't know if that's true, but we certainly see more and more in industry that it is no longer these kind of silos, that actually the most interesting science, and the pandemic's a great example of this, are taking place at the boundaries of scientific disciplines. And I think that's another area where, if we're going to play internationally on science, we have to be better at kind of high risk, high reward, interdisciplinary science. And we have to be more systematic about how we build these linkages. So I think, back to the pandemic, we were saved by our research community and the scientific community too much dependence on others to actually follow through on the science, and to some extent, too much on personal relationships and not enough on institution relationships and government to government. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. So I think we can all agree on the problem, or on the problems as they have been described, and of course we always have a good view of through the rearview mirror as to what had happened, and so thinking about how we go forward. Issues of scaling, brain circulation, mobilization, moving beyond a patchwork to a seamless and critical investments, and aspects of how partnerships and collaborations and relationships need to evolve to be more systematic, deeper, and sustaining to be able to achieve what we need to achieve. At the end of the day, it's also about the future that we want for the next generation, not only of the talent that's coming out of the universities, but the future for our children and the subsequent generations to enjoy the kind of quality of life, the kind of country that Canada represents with respect to the democratic principles, inclusivity, diversity, but also being able to be at the forefront of providing the world with the types of solutions and innovations that we have been known for historically. And how do we get there? And it strikes me that we have a good orientation to moving pieces of the puzzle. So the key thing right now is, do we need disruption? Do we really need a real disruption in the way we're doing things and our approach? COVID brought a future we all anticipated in many respects to our doorstep today. And so what are the next steps? What kinds of disruptions might we want to anticipate or think about in order to change the channel, so to speak? We have a country that's very complex. We have a federal government that makes huge investments and provides national strategies, but we also have a federation of provinces and territories. So I'll open it up to the key question of what it takes to get to where we want to go. Do we need something that's going to be disruptive? So Sophie, perhaps over to you to begin.
Well, disruption is always hard to go through. For sure, there are some major transitions in front of us, and the speed at which all of this will go will be much faster than what we are used to. And we saw that, I go back to my story of the different waves and their impact on the economy. The very first one lasted something like 60 years. The last one are in the order of 25 years. And we can expect that they're going to be shorter and shorter because of the volume and the number of opportunities that are coming up from science. So there are very critical decisions to make. And I think we need to to have a sense of all of what it takes. And I think Simon expressed that in different ways. And it is a real challenge for the state to decide, for Canada to decide all of what it takes to make it efficient. I think there's a number of disruption in the way we might have been looking at these things in Canada. Stephen alluded to that by saying, we need to go beyond bilateral agreement. We need to be part of greater international networks and accept to see different approach. And I'll give you an example. I have the privilege to share le Conseil de l'Innovation du Québec. And on that conseil, we have the chief scientist, the chief innovator, we have Investissement Québec, the commercial arm for new innovation in Quebec, and a number of prominent leaders in science and innovation and in businesses that are guiding new ways of working together, of connecting. And one of the way that Quebec is experimenting at this time is les zones d'innovation, bringing together leadership in all aspects of our innovation capacity to work around significant new industries, stream of industry that will have an impact on major transitions, such as climate change, energy, electrification of transport, and so on. So I do think that upfront there are significant, I'm not the only one to believe that, but I think we're all there, that might bring disruption in some aspect, but if we are capable of coordinating most of this transition at a high pace, we will be better off. But we do need to bring the actors together in a more intentional way and active way. So just to finish, one of the mindset that we've been having for so many years is that we've been putting money in university side. We're going to put money to you, you're going to manage that, but bring up partnership. That worked to some extent. Or we went to industry, so we're going to put money there. And, we're going to leverage if you have some kind of partnership with university. Work. The zone approach is that you guys need to manage the investment in a way that you make the whole work efficiently. And I think that the Netherlands were very, very aggressive in that strategy many years ago, trying to organize or structure the investment, the design, the capacity of research, innovation, and commercialization in a new frame and a new logic of responsibility to the whole, not to one or the other individually. So ideas to take into account, but I think this is disruptive in a way because we're not used to do this type of thing.
Thank you. Stephen?
Thanks. Well, I want to pick up on Simon's reference to high risk, high reward interdisciplinary work. I actually think that is fundamental, and that is disruptive because we're not really great at that. Most of the world isn't really great at it, but there are some good examples. Again, I'm very proud to say that's exactly what my new organization, CFAR, does. And it was one of the reasons I wanted to join it, because I find it so exciting, so intellectually stimulating to see these international groups working on big picture questions that fundamentally require interdisciplinary work. And I think we need to figure out how to do more of that in Canada. One of the obvious questions is, can we work with the granting councils to be more effective in interdisciplinary collaboration as among the granting councils? I know there have been efforts to do that in the past. I don't think we've got it to scale, and I don't think we've really delivered strongly on that agenda. I also think we do have to focus, as I said earlier, on key partnerships. And again, I know that the government is working towards Horizon Europe. I think that's really very important. But I think there are other partners as well where we might wish to learn and to engage with. I think Switzerland, partly because of its own travails with Horizon Europe, is an interesting partner for us to think about. They have an extraordinary capacity to turn their research into innovation, into successful companies. I mean, if you look at Swiss companies around the world, there are many, many more global Swiss companies than there are Canadian. And it's not a big country. So I also would pick up on Sophie's point around what's happened over the years in the Netherlands. I think they've had a very interesting strategy to develop collaboration across universities into industry. Sweden in the life sciences has been extraordinarily successful. So there are good examples that aren't just the United States. And that's one thing I would say. I don't know how helpful it is to always be looking to the US because of the scale of the markets, because of the investment of the military into research and spin-outs, which is completely different, and that's a distinction with Israel as well. We don't do the same kind of development as in the US or Israel, and so I don't think they're great models for us, but other countries are. I would also say that, and I want to be respectful here, but we know that Canadian business has not focused on R&D adequately over many, many years, despite tremendous efforts of encouragement from government and programs and tax incentives. I mentioned earlier that we have fewer PhDs in industry than most of the countries that I've mentioned. I will also say, in my experience, we haven't yet got to the point where Canadian industry as a whole sees the role of universities and the role of research and development as fundamental to its success. I mean, the number of times that I and colleagues have tried to encourage industry to speak up for science, to speak up for research, with frankly almost no success over many years. There are individual exceptions, great people out there, Ed Clark, others who've been superb, but not very many. And I think that's something that for Canadian business, it has to reflect on how it is going to grow effectively. And I hope that the experience from the pandemic, which you described wonderfully, might be a call to arms about how important it is for business to see what it can gain from fundamental collaboration with university, with researchers, generally speaking.
Before I turn it over to Simon and Alicia to comment further, CFAR is a wonderful example of born on a vision that was able to work outside the system, so to speak. So I think that's one aspect of it. And when we cite other countries and other exemplars of the models that we might be ones to look at more closely, ones to emulate, we speak of those countries from their national perspective. And I'm not certain in Canada we have the conditions to have that national perspective. We do, I think, with the commitments that the federal government makes, but it's complicated. And maybe I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Simon.
So I guess what I would say would be my experience in the role that I'm in now, where we work with the business sector, is that we're in a period right now of actually profound disruption and transformation. I mean, it's really shocking. And I have a bit of a compare and contrast because I happen to be in the #2 role in this organization about 15 years ago. So it's like seeing an aunt you haven't seen in 20 years or something, you know, like, or your nephew and suddenly they're 6 feet tall. You know, let me give you one example. So most of you probably own a car, or at least, you know, drive a car regularly. All of the major automotive manufacturers have all committed effectively to get rid of the internal combustion engine in about the next 10 to 12 years. And they all have serious plans to do that, and they're all investing many, many billions of dollars of capital to completely retool their operations to move away from gas-powered cars to electric vehicles. And this has profound implications for the supply chain. In Ontario, there are basically 5 major companies with 8 facilities, and the ecosystem of parts suppliers, it's about 500,000 high-paying jobs in Ontario, all dependent on these 8 factories, all of which are going to be shifting to battery electric vehicles. And every factory has a whole cluster of parts suppliers around them, all of which are set up to make parts for gas-powered cars, not battery electric cars. And by the way, you need a battery supply chain to actually supply the batteries for the cars that doesn't largely exist right now. And so there is a Wild West kind of Yukon gold rush to build these gigafactories, each of which is, the size of like 100 football fields, to pump out batteries for these vehicles. And once the vehicles are built, the electric grid can't handle the vehicles right now. So we're going to have to triple or quadruple the electric grid just to basically have these cars on the road. And this is all supposed to happen in the next 10 years. And this is not some pipe dream. This is actually happening right now with vast amounts of money being poured in these investments right now. And industry after industry, this is kind of what's going on. I talked a little bit about biomanufacturing. Biomanufacturing is being tipped upside down by the pandemic and everything in the wake of the pandemic. So I think, and we can talk about the aging of society, and you can talk about the rise of AI, and I mean, you all know this. I mean, you're all citizens. You all sort of live in the real world. Like, we're in a period, I think, of kind of pretty profound disruption. And I think the danger, in a way, of not finding out how to better plug the research enterprise and, and in the academic sector that, where a lot of this goes on, plugging it into what's happening in the rest of the economy and society in a really profound way, is that you potentially wind up, or the research sector potentially winds up being a stakeholder to be placated with, little top-ups of the research money every couple of years so that people don't get upset, but is not actually kind of directly plugged into, the profound changes that are going on in society. And so, for example, in my organization, when we go to the business community, or we want, we have things we want. Like, it isn't just, they're not just a stakeholder to be placated, say. It's like, we actually want you to build this factory to make vaccines. We went to Moderna, had a conversation with Moderna, we want you to set up a facility here. We have certain things we want from you, because we think actually this is really, it's going to create jobs and all that, but we have a very important national security and societal objective to be achieved. And I think the holy grail would be governments, or, government as a proxy for society, is coming to the research sector saying, we have these urgent things we want from you. I feel a little bit in the past, I know it's a bit overstated, but there's been a bit of a dichotomy between, we have fundamental science and discovery science, and we need that. I mean, lots of wonderful things come out of people just asking curious questions. And then there's kind of like this applied science, and it's kind of dirty to mix the two, and people, they get nervous when governments come and they want to impose commercial objectives. I wouldn't describe it that way. I think there are all of these social problems to be solved. There are real pressing issues that elected officials and policymakers are worried about. And we're really interested in finding out a way, how do we ensure that the science and the research that's going on can be relevantly brought into helping us solve this problem, and finding a way to kind of urgently connect it. And increasingly, those problems are operating at high speed, at scale. They're interdisciplinary problems. They're not quaint things that fit into the boundary of a discipline. And I would say, and this is not a knock on anything, but our institutions, and I would include my own institution, this is a huge struggle for us, are still set up along these kind of old lines. We're not very good at thinking out of the box. We're not very good at working across disciplines. We're not very good at doing things that are high risk, which means that high risk means the failure rate's really high, but it also means, there might be a high reward. We're just not good at that. It's just easier to do what we've done for a long time. And I think the stakes are a lot higher now. So there's an interest in trying to find, so I actually think that we are in a period of profound disruption. And if you were to ask me, I think there's risk in that, but there's tremendous opportunity, because in some respects we can hopefully refashion some of our institutions. And I would say at the federal level, and Frédéric Bouchard, many people here will know, the government's got a panel. Now, this is not an advertisement for Frédéric's work, by the way. I don't think they're going to come out and recommend burning the whole system down or anything. But I think the government is interested in understanding, how can the granting enterprise, how can our research, funding institutions maybe be, as effective as possible, and help to respond to some of these issues around interdisciplinarity and so on. Because back in the kind of economy, and back in the problems governments are confronted with, it is a period of kind of profound turbulence. And I think, there's a huge opportunity in a way to think about how can we help support research to be able to kind of respond to that. And I think the promise of that is it holds the possibility of more attention, more funding, more support, because we can more directly be, having the research enterprise kind of responding to these urgent issues that everybody's worried about.
Thank you. Alicia, just to think about the the gaps, or what might be needed, what would be the ideal tools and instruments, and how do you get to those tools and instruments?
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen. Well, I wanted to build on the comments of all three of the previous panelists. And, again, to take up that challenge of how do we better marry our research excellence and our granting council efforts straight through to solving these global issues and international challenges that also have economic growth potential. And, we talked about talent, and we talked about how good our inventive talent is. We also, in one of the comments that you made earlier, Simon, you spoke about the distinction between personal networks and institutional networks, and saying we relied too much on personal networks in our response to COVID. And I would actually propose that we double down on investing in personal networks. And the reason I would say that is that our scientists, their networks with their alumni from their lab, are extraordinarily strong and international and built into industry. And if we actually doubled down on those and supported them with creative and flexible funding, that we may have enormous value unlocked in those calls to industry is one point. A second point, and in response to crises, a second point is we have this intangible asset. We have this fantastic resource of our inventive talent. And in our PhD students, which we attract from around the world, but in the PhD students that we graduate, only 20% of them go on to tenure-track academic positions. That other 80%, as Professor Toop, as you mentioned earlier, we don't have as many as other countries that are actually going into industry. And that's a challenge. It's also a bit of a curiosity. Why not? Well, my thought is that we have a lot of SMEs in Canada, much more so proportionally than our peer countries, and that they don't necessarily know what to do with those PhD scientists and engineers in particular, but PhDs across disciplines, because that talent has been too narrowly educated. They're fantastic scientists and engineers and researchers, but we may not, as educators, have equipped them to be able to know what keeps the CEO of that SME awake at night, or to be able to be entrusted with being a bridge back to university and government research labs and out to leading new product development. So I would say that resource, those networks, those international networks of our leading PIs across the country, which again, we punch above our weight, that we think about how we invest in those and how we mobilize those networks, how we support those HQP in actually building the receptor capacity that we want in industry, both nationally and internationally. That we can build those bridges, but it starts with education, in my view.
Please, Sam.
Yeah, no, just maybe just in response. I agree actually with the importance of personal networks. And in fact, as I noted in COVID, hugely important. It's more that the institutional structures, funding mechanisms, et cetera, shouldn't necessarily be indifferent, say, to the power of those. So when I think of my own organization, or I think of other issues that we confront, we don't want things to work in spite of the system. You kind of want them to be accelerated and supported by the system. So it's not so much, let's have institutional networks, not personal networks. You sort of want both, but you don't want to be overly reliant on entrepreneurial individual professors who happen, or prominent Canadians who happen to know people abroad. Like, we ideally should have structures and systems that are encouraging those linkages. And I think we rely almost too much. We have relied too much, I think, on letting individuals sort of, explore creative relationships with the Europeans. We haven't done enough in the past of things like joining Horizon Europe and being a real player in some of these international collaborations. So, but I agree with your point.
So, Stephen, please.
I just want to pick up on your point, Alicia, around how we educate doctoral students, because I think you're absolutely right. And it's something we really have to think about seriously. Just to note that in the UK now, almost all graduate funding is going to be structured around graduate training programs, not individual funding of individual researchers through granting councils, but programs that will only be funded if they actually have a lot of the additional elements of what it is to be a PhD not working in academia, because as you say, most won't work in academia. And some of that is around inclusion and diversity, which is a really powerful force, but some of it is around soft skills. It's around understanding how to communicate. It's understanding how business works, et cetera. So I think, looking at those kinds of programs would be very beneficial for Canada.
I've often heard people refer to what we commonly call soft skills as power skills. Yeah. And I think when we think about it that way, I think there'd be a significant twist in the way in which programs would embrace that as well. So I know that we're running against some time constraints, but I did want to open it up for one or two questions from the audience. We have a few minutes. There's microphones on either side, so please, and Jeffrey, following, please go ahead.
I know I'm in good company. Jeff is there. I have a question. I had a question, and then you started talking about skills, and then I got really excited because we are very much aware that in the social science and humanities that most of our graduate students, PhD students, will not get job in academia. And the situation is worse for us because the outlets outside of academia for the kind of research we train them to do very narrowly are very limited. But I don't want to, my question was not about that. Yesterday, the first panel I attended was on transdisciplinary collaborations and their importance. And of course, this is something that's crucial. One of the panelists suggested, we asked one of the panelists, what are your priorities? This was the director or the president of the Berlin University Alliance. And the first priority for this organization is social cohesion. That's very interesting because when you're talking about the societal challenges, there's not much about the sort of more dirty aspect of the societal problems that are wicked problems, that are things that social organizations have to deal with. And this is interesting to me because in order to be able to make sure that our social sector is flourishing, that's where we want to get it, we also need innovation. We need innovation in the social sector. Some people think of policy for social innovation as social policy. I think of policy for social innovation as innovation policy. We need to mobilize knowledge. We need to train our students to be able to take up position in the social sector that are going to be a good ground for these kinds of collaborations that are going to help mobilize knowledge. And I want to know, and I know that Stephen Toop, of course, was the chair of the Federation of the Humanities and Social Sciences for a while. So I wonder if there is something that you could tell us about your views on what Canadian universities can do. And I'm especially interested because we have a panel this afternoon that's called Rebooting the Social Impact of Universities, Skills and Knowledge for Societal Innovation. So I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more about that.
Well, I think I would start by saying I agree with everything that you said. And I did refer to challenges to the future of democracy, challenges around income inequality. You add social cohesion, absolutely central questions facing our own society and many others around the world. So I think it's really important that we don't think of innovation, to your point, as something that only happens in STEM disciplines and industries that flow from STEM disciplines. It's absolutely clear that for many of the issues that we're talking about, climate change being the obvious example, if we don't think about how it is that societies organize themselves and how social change takes place, with all of the technology in the world, we're not going to make the transitions that we need to make. So I would say you're absolutely right that for PhD students in the social science and humanities, I think it's redoubly important that we really think about the broader context in which they may be operating in society. I think there's a real role to play for people deeply understanding of how societies are organized, how humanity expresses itself. I mean, these are fundamental issues for all of us. And I would say that we have to get away from the dichotomy between social sciences and humanities and STEM disciplines. There's a continuum, frankly, of need if we're truly talking about interdisciplinary exchange. Now, this is a conference about science policy, but it's also a conference about innovation. And I think you're absolutely right to think that innovation crosses all of those sectors.
Great, thank you.
Could
Jeff.
I just mention something? We
We have another question, and we're running out of time, so
Okay.
if you don't, Jeff, please.
Thanks, Stephen. Social change happens at the institutional level, and I have a question for Simon about government, and I have a question for everyone about academia. So two problems have been highlighted today. One, the risk aversion within government. I mean, there are smart people like Simon. I've met many people, worked with many people in government who know the problems and are trying to fix them. But there's a risk aversion, and the KPIs that they have to check certain boxes. They say, oh, we can't do that. We can't put these companies ahead of the line because we're not allowed, et cetera. So my question about government is, at what level do you have to go to empower the lower levels to take risk? Do you go to the PMO? Do you go to the deputy minister? Do you go to COSO? Do you go to the Treasury Board at the federal level? How can we unlock that risk of, change that risk aversion in government? So I'd love your wisdom on that, Simon.
You got 10 seconds, Simon, to answer.
And
do a panel
on the
on that.
academic, the 80% who don't go on to be tenure track, again, where can the change happen? Do you have to go to the president of the university? Do you have to go to the provincial governments? Can the federal government play a role? No, the provinces will say, get out of it, it's education. How do we solve that now? Who do we talk to? Who do we convince? Who can change? Those are my two questions.
Okay, we could do a whole panel on this question. Look, I think
We'll do it at the Research Money Conference in April.
I think, look, maybe it's profound glimpse into the obvious. I think context matters a lot, and so I think a couple of things. I would say actually, the federal government over my career, we've been pretty good at taking risks, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But there are all kinds of things that I could point to that are quite innovative and significant and so on. And I think they're kind of maybe gets lost in the noise or whatever. But the pandemic's not a bad example. So in the pandemic, people didn't wind up like out on the street because they couldn't pay their rent or they couldn't buy groceries, right? The government stood up and literally the space of about a week, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and checks were coming out the door within a matter of days. Hugely risky, by the way, because we now know that people got money that didn't need it. But the objective was not, the normal way you'd give out government money is you'd fill in a long form and then you mail it in and then we look at it and then we call your neighbors to make sure you deserve the money and you do some due diligence because we don't want to send checks to people who don't need them. But when there's an emergency and the whole economy is going to collapse, the context changes and politicians who, after all, have to be elected by people like us, understand that the bigger risk is that people are going to lose their home and they're not going to be able to eat and so on. And so the risk calculus changes and then everything changes accordingly. I worked in the transport ministry when I first came to Ottawa, and in the early 1990s when I was there, the government sold CN. And what was interesting was CN was a money-losing organization, it's not very efficient, et cetera, et cetera. And then CN was sold, and within a matter of a couple of years, it was turning profits, and everyone's going on about the wisdom of the private sector. Okay, it was the same people running the company that had been running it when it was a Crown corporation. The difference is as a private company, they didn't have to worry about chopping off, unprofitable rail segments because some community was going to get mad. Because, if the community gets mad, so what? We're not elected by that community. We don't have to worry about it. So the context matters a lot. And I think, part of the solution is not just we need better rules in government, or we need to get better deputy ministers. There is a cultural thing. You don't want to promote a culture. It's a risk-averse institution for a bunch of reasons. You don't want to be sort of leaning into that and making it more risk averse than it needs to be, but the risk aversion is in some respects a reflection of the context. So I think if we want to have more risk taking, then you got to change the context. So one way to do that is you move functions where you truly want a lot of risk taking out from underneath the government system, and you stick them out in a crown corporation that operates at arm's length, where they can kind of make decisions insulated from the day-to-day vagaries of answering in the House of Commons. Another would be, it's a little tougher, but it's not impossible, is you build a narrative that helps the government and helps politicians and helps decision makers be able to better explain, why we're taking risks, because the risk reward, calculus is such that, it's smarter to do that. And I think the pandemic's a great example of that, in which, look, we bought more vaccines than we needed. Someone's going to criticize us for that at some point. We bought a lot of vaccines kind of on spec. They hadn't been developed yet, but that's what everybody was doing to make sure they could get vaccines. So that was explicitly money at risk. Some of those vaccines aren't going to, Sanofi's still trying to make their vaccine. That was one of the companies we reached an agreement with. But the solution was, the issue was, are we going to place bets hoping one of them pays off, or are we going to not place any bets because we're worried that some of them will fail and then we're not going to have any vaccine? And people kind of intuitively get that. So I think, sorry, it's a long answer to a short question, but I think it is not just a matter of, we're probably more risk averse than we need to be. There are structural fixes to that. You can inculcate a culture at senior levels to kind of lean against that. I certainly try to lean against the kind of over risk aversion. But I think the fact of the matter is, I'm in an environment where if I accept a fancy dinner from somebody, that can be a problem for the guy I work with. It can be a subject in the House of Commons. It could be on the front page of the newspaper. And there is nobody in private business that has those kinds of consequences. And people adjust accordingly. These are very rational decisions being made in the bureaucracy. So if we're going to change that rational decision-making, you got to change the context in which decisions are made so you can get more rational decisions. And there's 100 different ways to do that. Thanks.
Sophie, a short response on the academic side.
Yeah, but I think that the good news is that a lot of what needs to be done is being done now. It took some time to realize and have a clear picture of the context. But for sure, the university have an important role. They need to take up to the task of providing the new type of competence-based, I would say, enhanced education for PhD to better prepare for other opportunities. And of course, university presidents always talk about funding, but I mean, it is an extended contribution to this education that is requiring new capacity to be good at it. But I think that this is moving up. I think that what we really need to enhance is the connection and open up the opportunities within the SMEs. And Alicia alluded to that, and to find to make more visible, give more visibility to ways of entering different corporation, government, enterprises with a PhD degree, and showcase how helpful it is for these organizations. That's a part that I think we don't do enough, and we should be doing more to make sure that we keep the talent in Canada.
Thank you. Time is pressing, but I will one more question. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Try to keep it quick. My name is Shweta Ganapati, and my question is actually very much related to what Sophie just said, and Jeff's question number 2. But just to put a finer point on the issue of training within research programs, graduate programs that train those students for the 80% of those jobs. I've done a little bit of research in this space, and I've heard from reviewer number 2, for example, that if we provide this type of training, for example, in a PhD program, we're changing the very nature of the program. We're taking away from the rigor of research. And of course, like, the unsaid part is also there is a research output that these students have, and it takes away from that to train them, to allocate timing, to train them for those skills that the CEO who's awake at night is looking for. So I just want to ask you, what would you say to academics who have that, I would say, at least somewhat legitimate concern?
Lisa, please.
Sure, thank you for that question. And also building on Sophie's response, I would say to those academics that do they want to see impact from their research? I would say that there's mechanisms that could be after the PhD, that could be, for example, a commercialization postdoc, which very nature could be designed to be translating to industry needs, could be de-risking breakthrough research. And critically, that postdoc should be something that can come out of the research lab, therefore should not require, the constraints should not be matching funding, otherwise you've lost any endowment. So thinking about those constraints carefully. And I would say that during the PhD and that training, that again, yes, if our measurements for the way that the rewards of academia are doled out are narrow in terms of number of publications and number of citations, they are acting rationally, to the point made earlier, to say, no, don't train my PhD students in that way. However, if, as in many cases, universities and organizations like DORA and others are trying to, and HighBar, are trying to change the way that those tenure and promotion, as well as later on chairs, are given out, we might be able to align the system. So I would say part of unlocking the value and the potential of those 80% of our grad students to make better impact, to make better careers for themselves, to help our innovation economy, to help meet these challenges, that if we had funding that was aligned with those objectives and training, that we could make a big difference.
So thank you. I'm keeping everybody from coffee, and I don't want to continue to do that, but we can go on for certainly hours here on this remarkable conversation. But what gives me a great sense of satisfaction, optimism, and gratitude is for the opportunity that we have to discuss these issues as we have today. And I'm particularly gladdened by the fact that we have a remarkable, outstanding group of scholars and academic leaders and thought leaders and policymakers who are shaping these conversations and lending their thoughts to this discussion. And I'm very grateful for our panelists, Sophie, Stephen, Simon, and Alicia, for your contributions. And thank you all for being here today.